why did Charles end up here for that famous 48 hours in 1651? The answer is one word: it's Catholics. It is because Boscobel was part of the Catholic underground network, which by 1651 is very well established and it's very well organised. We know that there have always been people in this immediate area who didn't accept the religious changes of the Reformation, who were practising Catholics, so there must have been priests knocking about. We don't know exactly, we haven't got a full list of who those people were, it was all illegal, but we know there have been priests on the Gifford estates pretty much from when the religious changes came in right up until the present day. So Catholicism becomes illegal under Elizabeth I, the Mass is forbidden, and after a certain date, any person ordained a Catholic priest is automatically a criminal in the eyes of the state. What the state wants to do is cut off the supply of Catholic priests, so all those who were ordained in the previous reign will gradually die off and Catholicism will eventually sort of wither away. So what Catholics need to do is ensure there is a supply of new Catholic clergy. They train them on the continent, they smuggle them back into the country, and the question then is what to do with them. And they soon discover simply having them as staff in a house doesn't work, because the houses are being raided and the Catholic priests are being identified and they're being arrested. So they find they have to create a series of hiding places and safe houses in which to conceal the priests. The government has a network of informants both in and outside the Catholic community who know who these people are. They try and establish who they are. They provide descriptions. So you can have as many aliases and disguises as you like, but sometimes when people come knocking on the door at dawn looking for priests, you have to have a place to stow them in the hope that they can remain concealed until such time as the priest hunters have left.
So they're not necessarily always tied to a domestic household. They are just perhaps hiding priests generally.
Yes, there are different approaches at different times in different parts of the country. Boscobel is interesting because Boscobel is associated with the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits are the bogeymen of the English Protestant imagination. They imagine every priest is a Jesuit, which isn't true.
And they're the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation, aren't they, really?
That's exactly why they spook everybody, because they see themselves as the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation. They're going to roll back the Reformation, even if they have to do it one soul at a time. And they are structured on a military basis. They pride themselves on their efficient organisation, on a clear command structure, and they take a special vow they will go and do whatever the Pope wishes them to do. So this terrifies the English state. They really see them as this new, effective foreign force. It's not like dealing with the good old English Catholic priests they knew from years ago who went along with religious changes. These people are very zealous, they're very professional, they have a very clear idea of what they're going to do and how they're going to do it.
So it's a spiritual and political war almost going on here.
You must remember the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius of Loyola, was a soldier in his youth. He becomes a priest later on, but he structures his society very much along military lines. You have a superior general who answers directly to the Pope. And then the command structure is all within the Society of Jesus. They don't like things like bishops and archbishops interfering what they do. And of course in England they don't have that element because there are no Catholic bishops resident in England. So they can pretty much do what they like. It ruffles the feathers of the other English Catholic clergy, that's another story. But the Jesuits basically established their own structure in England. They start arriving late on in the reign of Elizabeth I, and we know they're active in Staffordshire in the Elizabethan period, initially in North Staffordshire. And by the time Charles is around, they're very well organised. The Jesuits in England become a province in 1622, which it's a bit like head office in Rome is opening a branch in the UK with its own regional manager, and that is set up in 1622. We have a British province of the society. And we know that the organisational structure of that to an extent because, being a good Jesuit, the newly appointed provincial writes to Rome explaining that he's open for business and how he's setting up shop. And he tells the Superior General he has designated 3 district houses as hubs for Jesuit activity in England and Wales. In a normal Jesuit province, you would have a provincial house. Jesuits, because they are a religious congregation, they're not just regular parish priests, there is a communal element to the way that they live, even to this day, and ideally you will live with a group of other Jesuits. Under persecution, this is not possible. And most of them, at the most, they operate in pairs, many of them operate in complete isolation from any other priests at all. And so in Jesuit spirituality also, all of them should come together at least once a year for a spiritual retreat. You would normally do that in your provincial house. The question is, how are they going to do this in England? How are they going to have somewhere where they can get together to recharge their spiritual batteries and to meet each other face to face? So the safest thing to do, of course, is to split them up as much as possible. So it's 3 properties rather than one central one on a regional basis. We know the locations of 2 of them because subsequently they were raided. One was in London, in Clerkenwell, and the other one was in a very isolated farmhouse on the Welsh borders called the Coombe. But one of the things the Jesuit provincial writes to the Superior General is that he has found a house in Staffordshire which he has acquired for the society, where he says it has room for 10 men. He writes this in 1622. There is a Staffordshire district of the society which also includes Shropshire, and at various times it includes Cheshire and Wales as well. The question is it here? Interestingly, the priest hides we have at Boscobel are extremely late for this type of construction. Most priest hides are built between the Spanish Armada and 1600. Ours are 17th century. We have one definite hide and one possible hide/escape route. It's a matter of debate as to what the one in the Squire's room looked like originally.
That's the one behind the chimney you're talking about,
behind the chimney, because the floor is much later. We know this part of the house is built in 1624. And so it dramatically increases the accommodation available at Boscobel House. And the question is, well, why? Because Boscobel House is officially a hunting lodge, but we have no record of any hunting ever taking place here. We have no record of the tenants living here ever engaging in anything that could be connected to hunting parties. So why are they increasing the accommodation here? We know there are priests in this part of Staffordshire. We don't know who they are, the names of them at this point. But we know that by the time Charles II comes along, there are probably about 8 Jesuit priests operating in Staffordshire. After the Civil War, we know there are 8 Jesuits in Staffordshire. We also know that within the lifetime of Charles II, in 1678, there was a gathering of Jesuit priests in this house. It's also, interestingly for our volunteers, it's the first recorded tour group ever to come to the house because it was connected to Charles II. The principal reason they came here was because they were having a profession ceremony. A priest who was not previously a Jesuit decides to become a Jesuit. And so he joins the society in a religious ceremony which is held at this house. And we know that around 20 Catholic gentry turn up to the house. And we know that 6 priests arrive at the house. It's very, very unusual to have a gathering of 6 Catholic priests all in the same building at the same time during the penal times, the periods of persecution.
Because the tensions are still pretty high, 1678, aren't they?
And it's still illegal.
Yeah.
It's still illegal to be a practicing Catholic, and to be a priest is a capital offence.
So how do we know that this took place?
Because there was an informant. A chap called Stephen Dugdale spilt the beans to the authorities. Stephen Dugdale was a Catholic. He was an associate of the infamous Titus Oates, who was a huge purveyor of what we would now call fake news about Jesuits. And as a result of the Titus Oates plot, most of the Jesuit priests in Staffordshire were arrested. Only 2 of them escape arrest. Most of the priests who attended the Boscobel gathering were also subsequently arrested within 12 months, when this essentially a Catholic witch hunt begins. Ironically, the Boscobel gathering are accused of being a meeting to plan the assassination of Charles II, of all places. And 2 of the priests who attend are subsequently executed, and 1 of them dies in prison. But the fact that a group of Jesuits got together in the same place, and they got together specifically to witness a new recruit to the society, would suggest that this house had some significance for Jesuit priests in particular. This is normally a ceremony that would take place in a provincial house, a profession ceremony. We also know that in 1713 the Jesuit district superior in Staffordshire was living in this house. And we know later on in the 18th century, again, we have records of several Jesuit priests who lived at Boscobel House specifically.
So the one in the 1700s, is that Father Collingwood?
Father Robert Collingwood was the local Jesuit superior, and he did live at Boscobel House. He moved about a bit, which was probably a sensible thing to do. He lived at Black Ladies towards the end of his life, but he spent a period of time living in this house.
And what was the atmosphere like then for Catholics at that time? Because we're talking now into the Hanoverian period, aren't we?
Yes. It is still illegal. Catholicism is not legalised until 1791. Catholics do not become full citizens until the early 19th century. But the period of active persecution in which priests are being killed finishes, ironically, in the reign of Charles II with the Titus Oates plot. That is the last occasion in which English Catholic priests are executed for being Catholic priests as the result of the Titus Oates plot in the late 1670s.
Was that partly the fact that unravelled later, that people realised that the popish plot was actually an invention, a fabrication? Was that part of it?
I think that was part of it. The atmosphere in the country was less religiously charged. The nature of English Protestantism becomes less fiery and zealous. There's less sort of apocalyptic language about. And things gradually sort of boil down. And the idea is beginning to emerge that not necessarily that Catholics are right or doing the right thing, but you can at least put up with them.
So there's an element of toleration, I suppose.
Yeah, and it is in a very relative sense. But the desire to hunt down Catholic priests on the part of the state has decreased. There are still people who try to make a living out of doing so, but the enthusiasm for following up on these leads and for enforcing this legislation that you should hunt these priests down has waned considerably.
So what do you think Collingwood's doing here?
Well, I think the evidence that Jesuits were connected to this house, specifically that we know that they did on occasion gather here in numbers, which was an incredibly risky thing to do, and the fact that he was living here would suggest that he had this as his regional hub and that he was using this as a base to coordinate the activities of the society in Staffordshire and Shropshire. We know that he had his own congregation which he ministered to. At its height in the 18th century, there were actually 3 Catholic congregations meeting on this estate. This was the largest concentration of Catholics in the Staffordshire-Shropshire border area because of the Gifford family and because of the protection that they could give. The reason that we get this period is characterised as the time of country house Catholicism is because it was the people that lived in the country houses, had the money and the connections to keep their priests safe. Peter Gifford, who was head of the family when Charles II was here, was actually the uncle of Bonaventure Gifford, who becomes one of the first Catholic bishops to be active in England after the Reformation. And he is given by his nephew a property on the Gifford estate at Longbirch Farm to be his base. So we have a Jesuit superior living here, and a few miles up the road in Codsall Wood we have the local Catholic bishop, the other aspect of Catholic hierarchy in England, also living on the same estate.
When do we start getting Catholic bishops back then?
Initially in the reign of James II. They tried to do it in the reign of Elizabeth I, and the first bishop was actually called William Bishop, so he was Bishop, but it became far too hot for him and he had to return to the continent. They start doing it again when James II comes to the throne as a Catholic king. When he leaves, of course, all of the bishops are subsequently arrested, including Bonaventure Gifford. I think one of them manages to escape, and they sort of quietly return under William and Mary and start operating still in the underground. But there's a feeling that you can risk doing things by the late 17th century that you couldn't have done in the reign of Elizabeth I, for example.
So there's a sense this place is possibly somewhere where seeds were being planted to regrow, if you like, the Catholic Church within this area, building on the existing Catholic communities that were in this area, using it as a base for the Jesuits, who of course were trying to re-establish and win converts back to the Catholic faith. And this was a safe place, a place protected by landowners and wealthy people who were able to offer that kind of protection. And as persecution perhaps started to wane, this became even more prominent, perhaps even as a training ground possibly?
It's quite possible. It's possible. I mean, the exact nature of what went on here, we don't know a great deal about. It pops up here and there in the records with huge gaps in between. We know that Mass was said in the attic because William Pendral's granddaughter told a visitor that it was a non-Catholic visitor. We know that by this stage they're even willing to disclose the location of one of the hides. They actually keep one sort of in the back pocket initially for a good few years, and they just reveal the one in the squire's room initially. Obviously, they would have been open to making converts, but I think at this stage their main focus is on simply keeping the Catholic community together.
Keeping it alive.
Yeah, they don't really have the resources to be going out and openly proclaiming it and trying to attract too many new people. It's trying to consolidate what they have already, and this is an area in which they can do that because there is a great deal of local sympathy amongst people who also have local authority for what they are doing.
So they're trying to hold their own, really, against state persecution, as it were.
I think the best thing to think of it in the late 17th, early 18th centuries, this is a small sort of Catholic enclave in a largely Protestant county, but it is an area where they feel that they can operate and they can organise and they can have a building dedicated to their activities. It's impossible to prove 100% that Boscobel was the Jesuit district house in Staffordshire that's described in 1622, but I think the nature of the gatherings that took place here and the nature of the people who did live in this house makes it very, very likely that it was.
Do you think then that when the hunting lodge, as it were, was built, 1620s, you were talking about 1622 with the establishment of these 3 Jesuit houses around the country, was it built, do you think, specifically for that purpose or possibly for that purpose at that time?
I think that the fact that the extension is put on, which increases the accommodation, and that is also, of course, the bit that contains the 2 priest hides, would point to that. It is very, very unusual to have 17th century hiding places for priests because the network was already very well established of Catholic safe houses by then. The building work had stopped because they already had these things in place by 1600. We are very odd to have priest holes that are as late as the ones that we have.
So potentially purpose-built for that very specific purpose, 1622 or thereabouts.
Yes. And the fact we know that this is a house that Jesuits are frequenting and they're frequenting it in numbers on occasion, which fits with it being a house where they feel they can gather.
However, of course, it's owned by the Gifford family, who are known Catholics. Does that not make it vulnerable?
It makes it vulnerable, and we know that there have been at least 3 raids on the house, one of which was in the aftermath of the Titus Oates plot. That is the raid in which bloodhounds were used. It often gets confused with the Charles II episode. They didn't use dogs in 1651. They did use it when they were hunting priests in the 1670s.
Which is also misleading on the Boscobel chest, isn't it?
Yes, well, I've never thought about that, but quite possibly, yes. So it is a house that's at risk. I mean, one Catholic historian wonders if Lord Derby, who told Charles about the house, had known it was a house frequented by Jesuits, would he have recommended that the king go and stay in it? It's possible that he hadn't been told. Of course, he himself was not a Catholic. But yes, it's a place where there's a reasonable expectation of security, largely because the local tenant farmers, many of them in the neighbouring properties, are Catholics, the landowners are Catholics, but the risk is always there. The fact, as I say, that 2 priests we know who spent time at this house were subsequently executed. Several of them were arrested. One died in prison. It's still very risky. It can still get you killed throughout the reign of Charles II. Despite everything that was done for him, and despite the fact this house saved him, people connected with this house are still at risk of execution.
Now, I know that you actually did a great deal of research on recusancy. I'm guessing that recusancy would also give the authorities almost a helpful list of the people who were Catholics. What would have been happening here as far as recusancy fines were concerned?
Well, we know that in the 1640s, at the tail end of the Civil War, there were 86 recorded recusants in the Brood area.
We should just clarify, recusare in Latin is to refuse to attend the Anglican service, isn't it?
There were some people who were, Catholics by conviction, but sort of went along with the Church of England in order because there was a legal requirement to attend Anglican services on Sundays and holy days. And if you didn't, you were fined, and the fines grew progressively the amount of time you stayed away.
And some of them were huge, weren't they, the fines?
Some of them were enormous, and many Catholic families lost their land and lost their homes in order to pay these fines. People like the Giffords could afford to pay fines on a regular basis. So those who were sufficiently committed as Catholics to refuse to attend non-Catholic services, which was what would be expected of them by their clergy, because of course in the 17th century Catholics believe and Protestants believe that they are the one true church. It is therefore a sin to attend the services of another denomination.
It's certainly not ecumenical, is it, at that time in any way?
The idea that it doesn't matter what your faith is completely alien to the 17th century. They wouldn't have understood it at all. So yes, the authorities know perfectly well who's not turning up in the parish church in Brewer on a Sunday. And so they know the Pendrels don't go. They know that the Giffords don't go. They know where they live. So they know these are the people who will be seeking the ministrations of a Catholic priest in order to carry on with their faith. Because if you're a Catholic, having access to a priest is not an optional extra. You can't baptise your children, attend Mass or get married if there's no priest to do these things for you. So they know that this is a Catholic house and they know it's dangerous. That was why Charles had to hide outside in daylight hours. It was known to be a Catholic centre. And it is a testimony to the ingenuity of the Catholic underground that under those circumstances they were able to keep their priests safe, they were able to keep their identities secure, and they were able to move them around the country. We tend to know more about those priests who were caught because they then appear in state papers. So we know about what happens at the houses that are raided. The interesting thing about Boscobel is, even though we know it was raided, we don't have a record of any priest being caught on the premises. So those priests that were in residence and what they got up to exactly with Boscobel is very much unclear. We know about the other Jesuit safe houses because they were raided and people were caught in them, and particularly the one in London. But I think that these small sort of snippets, these sort of moments of light in the historical record of Jesuits hanging around this house, they would have had to have a good reason to hang around a house like this. I think it points to this house being much more significant than just another Catholic house. I think it was a hub for Catholic activities, and by the 18th century it certainly was. There was what was known as the Black Ladies Boscobel congregation. They would have Mass either here or at Black Ladies' house. And the priest would be in residence in one of those houses, and we know that by the 18th century there were visits to Catholic bishops in this area, and candidates from this congregation were being presented for confirmation by the Catholic bishop.
And Collingwood himself, I think, was buried, wasn't he, at Black Ladies?
At Black Ladies, yes. I mean, he still is.
Yeah.
Although there's no evidence, there's very little evidence of the chapel there now, but yes, he was buried at the Black Ladies, yes. And also burials were going on at White Ladies in penal times as well. And they carried on using the burial ground at White Ladies right up until the 19th century when they built the current Catholic church in Brood.
Yes, well, it was the 1840s, wasn't it? Something like that.
The Pugin church in the 1840s, yes.
So you were just saying how many recusants were actually located in this area, or records do we have?
In 1644, we know that there were 86 people in the Brood parish who were Catholic recusants. So there were 86 people, adults, who were not attending church in Brood because they were Catholics.
Do you think we've got a figure like Father John Huddleston over at Moseley, who is the domestic priest there, isn't he? Do you think there was a domestic priest here as such, or was it just a place where people hid for a time, or were located for a time, or lived for a time? In other words, did the Pendrels actually have a sort of fixed priest here, or was it just access to a number of different priests who happened to be here and moved on as and when?
It probably varied over time. From that would have been the sensible thing from a security point of view. We know that I think it's very likely there has always been a priest somewhere on the estate available for local Catholics, which would explain why there was such a concentration of Catholics living on the Gifford property. As to whether they were resident at Boscobel all the time, that's unlikely. I think it's more like then. We know Father Collingwood, for example, when it was still illegal but slightly easier, he moved between properties on the estate. By the 18th century, as we're approaching the idea of Catholic legalisation, at Longbirch there was the bishop, the Vicar Apostolic as he was called, the missionary bishop, was living there with a chaplain, more or less permanently, and there were also a couple of other Catholic priests who were living in other properties on the estate. So I think it would have varied. There wouldn't necessarily have been a priest at Boscobel if you knocked the front door all of the time, but Boscobel would have been a place where a Catholic priest could have come and said Mass, and he would have been not too far away.
So there's not a Father Huddleston figure, as it were, here, you don't think?
No, a property like this would be unlikely to have something like that, but there's definitely a priest in the neighbourhood. We know, for example, in 1651, when Charles turns up, there is a priest living in the house at White Ladies. So there would have been a priest attached to the Giffords. It wouldn't have been living in this house. It is only the tenant's house after all, but the Giffords would have had a priest they could have called on. The Giffords were a particularly devout Catholic family. I mean, the head of the family, Peter Gifford, who was here when Charles II was here. He was actually imprisoned at the time that Charles II was here, so he wouldn't have been around. But he had 6 ladies in his immediate family who were all Catholic nuns. His nephew becomes a Catholic bishop. many Giffords throughout the penal times give their lives for the service of the Catholic Church. It's a family who would have needed and would have wanted a priest, so there would have been one around. As to where exactly they were, we're not quite sure, but they were definitely in this immediate area.
And do you see any connection then, obviously, with the Giffords, with, say, Gifford House in Wolverhampton, where, of course, services were taking place long before the actual formal church that's been built around it today?
Absolutely. And the church itself is one of the claimants to be the oldest post-Reformation Catholic church in England. Gifford House was the townhouse of the Giffords, but of the Gifford family, but they essentially hand the whole thing over to the Catholic Church. And when the bishop moves out of Longbirch Farm, when it's felt better for him to be in an urban centre, he moves into Gifford House permanently, and that becomes essentially the Catholic cathedral for the English Midlands. At this point, the Catholic hierarchy of bishops and cathedrals and dioceses hasn't been re-established. So the chapel at Gifford House essentially becomes an acting cathedral, and it is where ordinations take place. It is a major hub for the Catholic community. The Midlands district was based on this estate for a long time, and at one point that extends all the way from Wales to East Anglia, and at one point even includes a big chunk of Wales as well. So the number of people looking to this area as a spiritual centre is quite extensive, and the bishops have to travel very large distances in order to administer confirmations, for example. So it points to this estate, the Gifford estate, being a place where the Catholic clergy feel they can put down roots and they can have a base from which they can coordinate their activities.
So the Jesuits were successful then in their aim?
Their aim was to keep Catholicism alive. And ultimately it was to win back England for Catholicism, but this doesn't happen, and I think the later generation of priests realised that this is not going to happen.
So a more realistic approach, perhaps, yeah.
The original people who were establishing the English seminaries abroad remembered a Catholic England from their youth. But as Simon Sharma, the historian, famously said, he said, what happens to Catholic England? And he said it becomes a cloak and dagger church. But they managed to hold on, they managed to keep things going right the way through to legalisation, and in that sense, what they did here and what they planned here was successful, yes.
And the process of legalisation, you mentioned 1791, the Catholic Relief Act, when it's possible to apply for a licence for a chapel and so on. Was anything done here?
Absolutely, it was done here. That is part of the reason we know how extensive the Catholic network was on this estate by then, because 3 licences are applied for on the estate for Catholic chapels. One, the Bishop's Chapel at Longbirch, Chillington and Black Ladies are all licensed as Catholic chapels. But
nothing here at Boscobel itself?
Not at Boscobel itself. We don't know when Mass stops being said in the house. It's probable, I think, it wasn't being said by then, and they were having the Mass at Black Ladies, and they set up the chapel at Black Ladies and they furnish it quite sumptuously, and we still have a few things that were in the chapel at Black Ladies that are still in Catholic hands today. So I think it's likely, and Father Collingwood eventually does, his final residence is at Black Ladies. I think that they didn't really need Boscobel by that point, and they decide to concentrate the brood end of things at Black Ladies. The bishop subsequently moves to Wolverhampton. They stop saying Mass at Chillington itself, and Black Ladies remains the Catholic chapel in this area until Pugin comes along and builds the church in Brood.
And does that finish off Black Ladies effectively?
It remains for some time as a Catholic school. They used it as a schoolroom as well as the chapel. The chapel is transferred, the saying of Mass is transferred to Brood. They keep the school for some time, and the Evans sisters actually provide an allowance for the teacher at the Catholic school in Black Ladies.
Though they themselves, of course, weren't Catholics at all.
No, absolutely not. They were evangelicals, really. They were very sort of low church Protestants. It was very good of them to do something like that, and somewhat unusual, but I think it's because they saw it as a benefit of the tenants on the estate. We know that they still had Catholics on the property at that point. The Catholic community by then was smaller in terms of percentage of the local population, but it still existed, and it still exists today.
So when did sort of Black Ladies, when was it lost really?
Well, the Catholic Church in Brood was finished, I think, 1844, and all of the sort of the chapel fixtures and fittings were transferred to Brood. They still have some of them today, and it continues. as a Catholic school for a little bit after that. We know that by the 1870s it wasn't being used as a school anymore, but interestingly there's a famous statue, it's known as Our Lady of Brood, was still in the building at that point. It wasn't until later in the 19th century it was moved into the church in Brood. And at some point the building that housed the chapel was demolished. It stands up long enough to actually be included in a sketch, and by that point there is actually a cross on the pinnacle of the roof. So it's later on in the 19th century, but by the time that they re-established the Catholic hierarchy, they've sort of moved to Brood. And Brood is a statement of survival. It was why Pugin loved the Brood Church so much. He was all for showing the historical continuity of Catholicism as an English denomination, not just something that's run, as one Protestant wag put it, an Italian mission staffed by Irish priests or something like that, So he loved having the commission at Brood, because here in this estate you have a continuous connection of Catholicism going right the way back to pre-Reformation period, and there are families who have stayed Catholic and remain Catholic right the way through the years of persecution. And
this idea of Catholic permanency and apostolic succession, yes. I suppose all these things fit together, don't they?
And it's why it was built in the medieval style. The Catholic Church in Brood is meant to look as if it has always been there.
What's happening at White Ladies at this time then?
Well, White Ladies is interesting. We know that at various times priests lived at White Ladies, and it is believed the statue of Our Lady of Brood was previously housed at White Ladies and was there in 1651. It remains in Catholic hands after Boscobel House itself is sold by the last Catholic owners, the Earls of Stafford. They keep hold of White Ladies, and it must surely have been for the religious connection. It remains in use as a Catholic cemetery right up until the 1840s. We know at one point that the Catholic chaplain in this area held the key for White Ladies. If you wanted to have a look at the White Lady site, you had to go to the Catholic priest to let you in. So it remains in use as a Catholic cemetery. This is something that occurs in various places in England. Catholics, they don't want to be buried in the Protestant churchyard, because if that happens there will have to be a service read by the Protestant minister. Regardless of who you were, the funeral would have had to have been taken by the Protestant vicar, because he was the only person legally allowed to do it. Some people simply had a Catholic service read beforehand and then they would be buried in the Protestant churchyard. Some Protestant clergymen would look the other way. But an ideal situation is to have an area that Catholics consider that has already been consecrated for burials, that they can use without anyone interfering with them. And White Ladies is ideal because it was a Catholic church. It would have had a nun's cemetery. It is already a holy place as far as they're concerned, and a suitable place to be buried. We definitely know that funerals took place there at night, because there's an account of somebody bumping into a funeral procession at White Ladies in the middle of the night, and we know they continued to use it right up until the 19th century. The last Catholic burial was actually a lady who'd been a housekeeper at Boscobel House.
So what was down there then? Because the house itself started to disappear, didn't it? The gatehouse, I think, was the last bit of it, wasn't it?
In the early 19th century, there was still the gatehouse to the property. The rest of the house, which was based on the old prioress's accommodation, has gone by this point. And so what you have is the ruined nuns' church, and in and around it you have a Catholic cemetery developing. And there were a number of Catholic memorials. Most of them are no longer extant. There are some, and the Catholics in the 18th century also build a wall around the site of the church to essentially enclose the burial ground. So we know it is still a place for Catholic burials. Pugin goes there and absolutely loves the place, because again it signifies what he loved, which was the idea of Catholic continuity. Unfortunately, he doesn't record in his diary whether he came to Boscobel. I'd hope he did, but he loved White Ladies, and he said he can't imagine why Lord Stafford would ever sell the place. So he would be very disappointed that he did sell it.
And is it your sense, in a way, that Pugin unwittingly actually led with the establishment of the Catholic Church in Brood? Unwittingly, if you like, but led to the decline of these places, because if Catholicism starts to centre on Brood, then of course White Ladies becomes less significant. They stop having burials there in the 1840s. Black Ladies ceases to become relevant and ultimately becomes a school. Is it actually the establishment of a central church in Brood, designed by Pugin, that actually leads to the end, if you like, of these counter-Reformation, if you like, settlements that were there for the Jesuits and the others in this area?
Yes, I mentioned before that this period is characterised as country house Catholicism. But with the easing of the persecution and eventual legalisation, that's no longer the case. The character of it changes. The Catholic Church in England is no longer dominated by aristocratic or gentry patrons. It starts to become more urban, it becomes more Irish, it becomes more open to converts, and the normal structure of Catholicism takes place.
Because we have to remember the 1840s is the time of the potato famine. Absolutely. As well, isn't it? So massive Irish immigration at that time.
We have by this point registers for the Catholic services on the estate, and we see Irish names increasingly cropping up and increasing as the time goes by. Irish baptisms and weddings and that sort of thing.
And they're coming into urban settings like Wolverhampton as well, Absolutely. Which are developing industrially.
Yes, and the Catholic Church is actually very keen on this transition. They don't want their church essentially organised by wealthy lay people. They want it in the hands of the clergy with a proper parish structure and with a structure of bishops. And in most places that move does happen. There are a few places, for example Swinnerton, where the Catholic Church remains the property of the Earls of Stafford to this very day, and they remain central to the mission and essentially still treated as an extension of their house.
Isn't that where Collingwood came from? Because that's near Stone, isn't it?
It is near Stone, yes. He did spend time as chaplain at Swinnerton earlier on in his career, yes. And of course, the Earls of Stafford owned Swinnerton House, but they also at that point owned the Boscobel estate as well. It's the same family, the FitzHerberts.
So when the FitzHerberts actually sell Boscobel, that goes to the Evans family at that point, is it?
Yes, it's initially acquired by the Evans family, so that is the first time that it goes out of Catholic hands.
Yeah. And how long did they hold on to White Ladies for?
They held on to White Ladies right up until I think it was 1931. That is not part of the sale to the Evans, it doesn't become part of the Bradford estate. It stays in Catholic hands, I think, because of the cemetery. Because it is a sacred spot. But as you say, as urbanisation, legalisation take place, the secret places become extremely neglected. By the early 20th century, many of them are in a serious state of dilapidation. They're at risk of being lost altogether, and one Catholic priest in fact compiles a book of these hidden places because he fears that they are soon to disappear. Even Harvington Hall, which is now the most famous Catholic safe house, is in a state of ruinous collapse by the early 20th century and has to be rescued essentially by a benefactor.
Well, half of Harvington Hall is gone, hasn't it? There's only about half of it left.
Well, yes, and when they pulled at the ivy on the front of the facade in the early 20th century, the front of the house came away with it. It was in that poor state. Even though it was still in Catholic hands, it simply wasn't being used.
And when we look at what you're saying, that we're losing the secret places at that time, well, White Ladies disappears, doesn't it? Black Ladies effectively disappears. Yeah. Boscobel survives, partly because the Evans sisters obviously fell in love with the story, but also you've got farming going on here, so there's an alternative purpose perhaps around this building?
Even with the farming, I don't think that would have been sufficient to save it. It survived.
Because it didn't save White Ladies, did it?
No, it didn't save White Ladies. Or many other old agricultural buildings. It didn't save the original building at Long Birch where the bishop lived, which is now a 19th century building. It's saved by Charles II, and I'm sure he would have smiled to say it is saved because of Charles II. It is because of Charles II that the Evanses get the place and essentially rescue it. If he hadn't spent those 2 days here, we as volunteers and staff wouldn't be here, and I very much doubt that the house would be here. If at the very most there would be a later building on the site. To have the priest hides and to be able to tell the story of the Catholic underground here is really thanks to Charles II. So the Catholic underground saves him, and he ultimately saves this building for posterity as well.